There is a significant event taking place at Buckingham Palace, and the rumors are spreading fast. Charles the King has had enough. What does that actually mean, though? There are a ton of reports that suggest an abdication. The palace is in full damage control mode, and the royal family is being rocked to its foundation. Could this be the turning point in King Charles's life? Or is there a more complex twist that is yet to be revealed? Come out what happens after King Charles steps down. A monarchy fell apart. On that calm February morning, everything momentarily stopped. King Charles broke centuries-old customs when he said, "I resign." It was a simple statement that rocked the royal family like an earthquake. Nobody anticipated it. Not the royal analysts who had spent years studying Charles's life. Not the British, who had only recently begun to refer to him as king. Not even the most seasoned reporters who typically forewarned the public about royal choices before they were made. On a clear day, the news struck like a bolt of lightning. In more than a millennium of monarchy, no powerful and competent leader had ever resigned voluntarily. No one in British history had waited as long as Charles to ascend to the throne. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, ruled the country for more than 70 years. He had studied the regulations and prepared all his life, preparing his time on the throne and honing his royal duties. Then, shortly after the start of his rule, he surrendered everything. The same moment was displayed on television screens all over the world. Charles appears worn out yet confident as he stands in front of photographers at Buckingham Palace. Within the palace, anarchy ensued. Completely unprepared, the royal staff scrambled to determine what would happen next. Government officials began calling one after the other with important questions that no one could respond to. Royal festivities that had been meticulously prepared suddenly had no significance. Crowds gathered in disbelief in London streets, gazing at their phones. Some wiped away tears, some argued, and some murmured. Many simply remained motionless, unable to comprehend the implications for a nation where the monarchy had long been the one constant in a world that was constantly changing. The questions came more quickly than the responses. Was Charles sick? Was a catastrophe concealed? Aside from the brief statement Charles had read, the palace said nothing more. Everything changed suddenly for Prince William. All of a sudden, the future he had spent his entire life preparing for arrived. He had anticipated inheriting the throne long ago, but now it awaited him right away. His strained face was captured on camera as he entered the palace, a man now confronting a fate he had assumed would be decades in the future. Prime Minister Harris convened an emergency cabinet meeting within an hour. Royal legal experts were called upon to describe a scenario that no one had ever anticipated. Edward VIII, the last British king to abdicate, did so out of love, not voluntarily, in 1936. The greatest challenge in contemporary history now confronted the royal family, which was founded on custom and lifelong service. It was the result of 3 unexpected words from a king who had had enough, not a scandal or a popular revolt. It raises the question as the palace gates close following Charles's startling declaration. What made a man who had dedicated his entire life to being king decide to leave, live in the shadow of his mother? Charles's life was never really his own from the first time he breathed within Buckingham Palace. When the nurses held him in his mother's arms, they were presenting Britain's future, not simply a newborn, a youngster who was obligated from birth. His early years were anything but typical. Charles was being taught the art of stillness while other boys ran through fields, climbed trees, and came home with dirt-stained faces and damaged knees. He learned how to maintain his composure in front of dignitaries and the general public by standing for hours at royal rituals from an early age. Every action he did, every word he said, and every motion he made were all meticulously crafted to represent the weight of the enormous burden that would eventually fall upon him. There was just discipline, responsibility, and the constant demands of the monarchy. No place for childish impulses or unrestrained laughter. There were boys all around him at school who didn't have to worry about a future kingdom. They were free to talk, play hard, and express themselves without fear of repercussion. Charles, however, was unique. His habits were too sophisticated, his speech too measured, and his stance too erect. He was already being molded into a king, while his peers relished the small pleasures of childhood. Growing up, Charles observed Queen Elizabeth II's unwavering commitment to leadership. She reigned with dignity, for 70 years, never displaying weakness or abandoning her duties. She was the ideal queen to the globe. Charles could never fully live up to the reputation she left behind, no matter how hard he tried. Every decision he made was evaluated against hers, and he consistently failed to meet her expectations. The problem was exacerbated by his personal life. A public heartbreak resulted from what began as a dream marriage to Diana. He was portrayed as the antagonist while she won the public's affection. The blame never seemed to go away, and the criticism never stopped. The comparisons to Diana persisted even after the public gradually warmed up to him again. Charles assumed a job that had previously been mastered by someone else when he at last became king at the age of 73. He put his all into it, managing the pressures of royal life, attending ceremonies, signing mountains of documents every day, and taking on countless obligations. But he was aware that one thing would always remain the same regardless of how hard he worked. His mother's legacy would always take precedence over his own, and he would constantly be compared to her. It wasn't because he wasn't prepared, after all. It was the excruciating pressure to live up to a standard that no one could ever surpass. Charles's choice did more than upset the throne because he bore the burden of his mother's inheritance. A family that was already on thin ice was rocked by it. A family that was founded on unity and tradition is now split. Will they be torn apart by duty and personal loyalty? The royal family is in trouble. The royal home felt different the morning after King Charles's resignation. All of the typical sounds of palace life had vanished, along with the soft footsteps, courteous welcomes, and meticulous rituals. A tight stillness fell in their place, interrupted only by hushed phone calls made behind closed doors. Palace employees, who was disturbed by this event, having witnessed decades of royal changes. It wasn't simply silent. It was the type of quiet that occurs when family members lose faith in one another. Security cameras saw Prince William getting out of his car before daybreak, his face unreadable. He was joined by Catherine a few minutes later. Even though she was usually composed in public, she appeared rattled that morning. While royal aides anxiously waited outside with piles of essential paperwork, they locked themselves inside the East Wing. William now found himself carrying the weight that had previously been on his father. He had anticipated many more years before ascending to the throne at 43. His life had been well planned, juggling his 3 children's upbringing with royal responsibilities. That plan was gone overnight. William had put a lot of effort into being an involved parent, scheduling soccer matches and school functions. However, the crown required complete focus. He would now spend more time with his kids outside of the house. Prince Harry received the news while eating breakfast in California on the other side of the world. Immediately, his phone rang, not from relatives, but from reporters hoping to get a response. He was already physically separated from the royal family. Crossing felt impossible now. Harry was stuck in a no-win scenario. Critics would accuse him of being dishonest if he spoke in favor of his father. They would accuse him of deserting his family during a crisis if he remained mute. The headlines would tell their own tale regardless of what he did. The brothers, who had once been inseparable, now lived in separate worlds. William was forced to abandon all personal goals and start getting ready for his new position right away. Harry said nothing while observing from thousands of kilometers away. However, his silence was quite telling. People gathered outside Buckingham Palace in the streets of London. Everyone was initially shocked. Opinions then diverged. Others carried placards expressing gratitude to Charles for his candor. Others conveyed messages urging responsibility to take precedence over individual preference. The monarchy had long represented stability to many. It seemed like a broken sign. It was viewed as a betrayal by some. Others believed the change was long overdue. Queen Camilla avoided the press as she walked through the palace's corridors in silence. She had supported Charles for decades, putting up with rejection and criticism in order to stay with him. Now that he was gone, her job was unclear. She was no longer merely his spouse or complete queen. She was somewhere in the middle, anything that has never been fully defined by history. Later in the afternoon, Charles's sister, Princess Anne, arrived by helicopter. She passed reporters silently, her expression solemn. Being the only family member to have been in the military, she had a unique perspective on duty. As the changeover started, Her presence made it obvious that she was there to support William. A monarchy founded on stability and tradition that had endured for a millennium was immediately in danger. Could it adapt and thrive when its leader voluntarily left? Or did this mark the start of the end, decline, or modernization? When Britain awoke the morning following King Charles's resignation, the country had undergone a permanent transformation. Behind bulletproof glass, the golden crown remained intact in the Tower of London, its gems gleaming as they had for ages. But overnight, the monarchy it represented changed, replacing it with uncertainty. The walls of Windsor Castle were adorned with pictures of kings and queens from the previous millennium, each one serving as a link in an uninterrupted chain. For the first time, that chain was broken, not by conflict, controversy, or crisis, but voluntarily. Duty before self has been a monarchy's guiding principle for ages. A king reigned till his demise, never moving away. That had been a broken belief. The question was whether the throne itself still mattered, rather than just who it inherited. Urgent talks were held behind closed doors in Parliament. Symbols were powerful, but the monarchy's function had always been more symbolic than political. What did it indicate for the institution's stability if a king could just leave? Students from all around the nation crowded university lecture halls, wondering if a medieval-era system had any place in the contemporary world. Institutional trust had been eroding for years. Many young people now interpreted this as evidence that the monarchy was just another outmoded custom. Some people continued to support the monarchy despite the situation. According to business executives, it increased tourism revenue and helped Britain gain international prestige. At a period when the nation felt divided, community leaders thought it may help unite people. Others contended that, if the monarchy was prepared to adapt to the times, it may still have a role in contemporary Britain. Behind the scenes, personnel at Buckingham Palace labored feverishly. The royal family's social media profiles were silent for 12 hours. They then made a comeback with well-picked pictures of Prince William interacting with the populace. A silent statement of continuity. Advisors contemplated the future behind the palace doors. A watershed had been crossed in the monarchy. It could either change to adapt to a world that is evolving or run the risk of becoming obsolete. The heir who never sought this moment is now the center of attention as the monarchy stands at a crossroads between outdated customs and required change. How did a guy who never imagined he would become king so quickly define what it means to be king to a new generation? The future king was a prince. Like a man in a dream, Prince William strolled through Kensington Palace's serene hallways. As he passed the paintings of former kings, men who had assumed the throne with the conviction that it was their destiny, the plush carpet muffled his footsteps. However, no one has inherited it in this manner, by abdication, by choice rather than fate, rather than death. His ascent to the throne had been meticulously plotted for years, a gradual ascent in authority. He should have had decades to get ready. Rather, everything changed in a single day. His 3 children sensed the change in the royal nursery. Prince George, who was only 11 years old, suddenly had a greater responsibility. The carefree days of attending school and playing football like other kids were coming to an end. He was now more than simply a prince. He was the heir apparent, a future monarch whose life had just been accelerated. William had put a lot of effort into providing his kids with a childhood that was as close to normal as possible. But now he was seeing that effort ebb and flow. Everything had changed with his father's resignation. The inevitable truth of their new positions had supplanted the careful balance he and Catherine had established. He even started to look different. Formal suits took the place of the casual attire he had previously worn. He spoke with greater precision and used well-chosen words. He appeared to lose the casual warmth that had made him so well-liked in favor of a more solemn and serious demeanor. He sat with senior officials for his first Privy Council meeting. As he signed the paperwork verifying the changeover, his hands trembled a little. His modest but firm presence and unwavering focus were seen by everyone present. His head had not yet been supported by the crown's weight, but it was already bearing down on him. People's reactions varied all around Britain. William, a leader who could modernize the monarchy while upholding its traditions, was viewed by some as a ray of hope. Others questioned whether he was strong enough to bear the responsibility, worried that the role would alter him in the same way that it had altered those who came before him. William had to make a little but important decision at Buckingham Palace. He relocated his office to a smaller room with a view of the grounds where he had once strolled with his mother, rather than the Grand King's workspace. He was aware of the impact this role had on his family. It had destroyed the marriage of his parents. After struggling under its expectations, his father eventually left. And now it was his turn, far sooner than anticipated. Whether he could do the job was not the question as he readied himself for his first address to the country. He had been trained for that all his life. Whether the work would allow him to stay the man he had always been was the true question. William was attempting to adjust to a monarchy he never anticipated so quickly, and Charles's choice had an effect that extended well beyond Britain. What else might happen if one of its oldest institutions could undergo such a drastic change? The effect of ripples. Diplomats looked at each other uneasily in the silent corridors of the United Nations. The news from Britain had come like a sudden storm, appending long-standing conventions and requiring immediate talks about the direction of diplomacy. The decision made by King Charles rocked governments everywhere. King Felipe VI of Spain called off public gatherings and convened urgent meetings with his advisors. The royal palace in Sweden remained silent, yet the quiet itself conveyed a powerful statement. Queen Margrethe left an emergency council meeting in Denmark with a look of obvious anxiety on her face, which is unusual for her. The effects extended well beyond Europe. A review of the economic impact on trade with Britain was requested by President Chun in China. Without mentioning the monarchy, the White House issued a cautious statement expressing support for the British people. The response was significantly more pronounced for Commonwealth countries. Republican organizations immediately started campaigns in Australia, claiming that nations ought to be free to distance themselves from the monarchy if a king could abdicate the throne. Lawmakers in Jamaica demanded talks on whether the British Queen should be ousted as head of state. The change was also felt in tourist sites. Because British tourists were typically fascinated by their own royal family, Thailand's tourism officials were concerned that fewer British tourists would travel there. Aware of the sudden surge in interest in monarchy around the world, Japan's Imperial Household Agency stepped up security. The discussion was fanned by social media. In Brazil, conversations regarding colonial past were connected to Charles's choice. Royal influencers in Indonesia had to deal with difficult inquiries about their applicability in the modern world. People all across the world discussed what this moment meant for monarchies everywhere, not just for Britain. The diplomatic impact was instantaneous. Charles has been instrumental in international environmental initiatives, utilizing his power to bring disparate points of view together. The organizers of the climate summit now rushed to cover the void. As royal patronages were questioned, conservation initiatives in Africa faced uncertainty. Security professionals also paid attention. Intelligence services surreptitiously assessed whether adversaries may use Britain's transitional period. Alliances were re-examined by defense officials, wondering if established diplomatic relations would hold up well during this transition. Rulers born into power considered this in royal palaces from Thailand to Jordan. A king had abdicated his throne of his own volition, not in response to a revolution or scandal. Everywhere in the royal halls, the same question was asked. What remained of the centuries-old custom that set monarchs apart from everyone else if they could just abdicate? When a king's reign is reduced to a brief interlude between succeeding and preceding rulers, what happens to his legacy? Unsure of how to classify artifacts from a reign that ended nearly as soon as it started, Charles's abbreviated legacy curators at the Royal Archive of the British Museum worked with exceptional urgency. There was an unfinished portrait of King Charles III. The eyes were vacant despite the background's meticulous painting, a fitting representation of a monarchy that was never given the opportunity to completely develop. After more than 70 years of preparation for the throne, Charles stepped down shortly after. A challenging question now confronted historians. How does one quantify the legacy of a monarch whose loftiest goals remained unfulfilled? Staff silently packed up the king's study belongings, books with handwritten notes in the margins, environmental studies with handwritten thoughts, and speeches that would never be heard inside Windsor Castle. Each object served as a reminder of unfinished plans. Empty seats at climate gatherings around the globe will serve as a reminder of the man who had been pressuring world leaders to act for years. Charles had transformed the event into actual change by using his royal authority to unite politicians and scientists. However, such influence vanished practically immediately after he resigned. His departure caused confusion for a lot of people. Unsure of how something so recent could already feel like the past, a young girl who had once handed Charles flowers during a hospital visit now clutched a framed portrait. Tourists paused at his coronation monument at Westminster Abbey, and tour guides found it difficult to explain a reign that ended nearly as quickly as it started. Charles was difficult for even historians to situate in the royal chronology. Charles would be remembered for his decision to resign, but British kings and queens were typically remembered for their actions throughout their reign. His choice defied decades of custom, leaving a hole that was difficult to fill in history books. William's coronation preparations proceeded in the meantime, far earlier than anyone anticipated. According to some inside the palace, he wanted a more straightforward ceremony, perhaps realizing that a grand celebration would only serve to remind everyone of the uncertainty his father's resignation had left behind. Charles appeared relaxed and thoughtful to those who saw him at his private estate. He seemed free yet uncertain as he strolled through high-gross grounds. Someone who had dedicated his entire life to training for a role he had chosen to abandon. Ultimately, Charles III's reign may be remembered more for his demonstration that even the most ancient customs are subject to change than for his actions. Is this the turning point that permanently alters the monarchy's future? Or is it a precursor to its unavoidable downfall? Let us know what you think by leaving a comment. For more, subscribe and share. Click the following video that appears on your screen as well. You'll like it.